Linda, take a deep breath. Just take a deep breath, Linda. It's okay. Linda. Linda, I'm going to read you some words. I need your help. I need you to print these out for me, okay?
Now, why are the cops even talking to the housekeeper? Well, because Patsy has suggested the housekeeper as the most obvious suspect. She was someone who knew the house, probably knew what John's bonus was, according to Patsy, knew the basement, and she was in financial difficulty. And of course, it's being presented as a inside job. And so who is the most logical insider here? Linda Hoffman-Pugh. So the cops are questioning the housekeeper because Patsy has kindly pointed them, the police, in her direction.
I'm going to read these words out and you need to print them out for me, okay?
What words?
Just print Mr. Go ahead. Try it the short way, Linda. M.R. Dot. That's great, Linda. That's great.
Besides actually insisting that she provide her handwriting, sort of live in front of the police, they also asked the Ramsey housekeeper a couple of questions.
I hear she's still wet the bed. Is that true?
Oh, yeah. Every morning. When I came in, Patsy already had the sheets off the bed and into the washer. The blanket was already in the dryer.
Which blanket?
JonBenet has her own special white blanket.
Did Patsy ever get upset by all this bedwetting? I mean, day after day washing those sheets?
What's the big deal? The washer's right outside the bedroom.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now, that in a nutshell is really the pertinent question. Did Patsy get upset if JonBenet wet the bed? And the housekeeper scoffs at this idea, and I think she's right. And I think this was something that Steve Thomas missed. I think Steve Thomas might have felt a certain way about a child bedwetting, but I think you've got to not ask how you would feel about it, but the question is, how did Patsy feel about it? And Patsy, who had had cancer, and I think she mentioned this at one point, she'd had cancer, and now she's dealing with the bedwetting of a child. In the scheme of things, this wasn't a huge priority for her. Now, I think there's another way to interpret that, which is if it didn't really bother her that her child was wetting the bed, then was Patsy sufficiently attentive or appropriately attentive or showing the proper level of care to her own child? And I think that is a completely separate question. But on this whole question of whether Patsy totally lost it, she found that JonBenet wet her bed and basically lashed out at JonBenet in a fit of rage. You've got to ask yourself, why would she not have done that on any of the dozens and dozens, perhaps hundreds of other bedwetting incidents? And the other thing to say as well is, did Patsy not ever get upset with JonBenet in any one of those prior incidents? And the answer seems to be no. The answer seems to be that Patsy just basically seemed to let it slide and seemed to think that this would sort itself out over time. I think the other side of it is, it wasn't that Patsy didn't know about it and didn't seem to show any concern about it whatsoever, because she did mention it to, was it Pam Griffith, the seamstress, and she was worried that JonBenet's incontinence and all of that might affect the whole pageant side of things. So it was something that Patsy was aware of, but Patsy didn't really seem to have the motivation or the energy to really do something about it. It seemed like she left that, in a sense, up to the housekeeper in a way to take care of. I think another way to think about this is if you have a dog and the dog is not house trained, and you just let the dog keep messing in the house, would it be fair to say that you perhaps a neglectful dog owner? And what do you think about that analogy? But I want to come back to the interview with Linda Hoffman-Pugh. It was actually conducted by Detective Fred Patterson. And bear in mind, he'd actually interviewed Burke earlier that day, so it was quite a busy day for Detective Patterson. And we're going to deal with that, the interview with the housekeeper, in more detail.
Now, print the word attaché. You need me to spell that for you? Mm-hmm. Okay. A-T-T. That's right. A-C-H-E. Great. Great. And now, beheaded.
But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, a very big thank you to Acapella Blue 4860. Thanks very much for your contribution there. Every little bit helps, so thanks very much for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button and let's get started. So isn't it interesting, the idea that the detective's got to spell out the word attaché? Because you can imagine someone like, well, let me put it this way. Is someone like Linda Hoffman Pugh, a housekeeper, likely to use that word generally? And I think another way of putting it is, do you think in Linda Hoffman Pugh's home there might be a book like The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie? Equally, do you think in Linda Hoffman Pugh's home they would eat pineapple with cream or milk? What do you think? And so if you think about certain elements of the ransom note, it speaks to a certain kind of sophistication that someone that like Linda Hoffman Pugh obviously doesn't have. Does that make sense?
Do you ever notice any unexplained bruises?
Unexplained?
You know, a bruise that doesn't look like it was made by a fall or a bump.
No.
Did she ever complain to you about being hit by either of her parents?
No.
Now, the irony here, and obviously the housekeeper doesn't know this, but the irony is that Patsy's basically thrown Linda under the bus. And when the officers are there, does Linda return the favor? Does Linda implicate Patsy in anything? Linda's just been asked whether Patsy would get wet over bedwetting, and Linda scoffs at that idea. Now, the interesting thing is how that changed over time. Linda would defend the Ramseys to begin with, and then later on, her feelings about that would change. And Linda eventually tried to write a book. And I think the original title, the working title of that book was Someone is Getting Away with Murder. And unfortunately, Linda lost the battle to get the rights to write that book, and so it eventually never saw the light of day.
The written word is invaluable. You can get an insight into what that person's IQ is, how they're using grammar, what the syntax is, looking at the content and the composition. And in this particular letter, what always struck me was that there was almost an effort to dumb down what the intelligence factor was of the author or authors of this note.
Indeed, and you see a mismatch in this effort to dumb down, where you have words like possession and business misspelled, I believe deliberately, while on the other hand you've got words like attaché, which someone who can spell attaché probably is able to spell business and possession. By the way, Dr. Stephen Pitt, the forensic psychiatrist, he's another peripheral figure we need to talk about. And that clip comes from just before 12 minutes from the REELZ documentary. Now, let's go to what Lawrence Schiller says about this particular part of the timeline in his book, Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. He says, earlier at 7 p.m., detectives Fred Patterson and Greg Idler knocked on the door of the Ramsey's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh. Now, I must say in the dramatization, I don't see a bald figure in sight. I don't see anyone who resembles Detective Fred Patterson. So much for verisimilitude. Anyway, when she first saw the police, that's the housekeeper, she thought something had happened to one of her own children. They asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table, and then they took her husband Merv downstairs to the TV room. In other words, separated them. He wasn't allowed to leave the room even to get a beer. Now think about how different the protocols were for this couple compared to the Ramsey couple. Just shows you what wealth and privilege buys you in terms of the respect of law enforcement, for example. And so in the kitchen, the police told the housekeeper that JonBenet had been murdered. She screamed and couldn't stop shaking. After Hoffman Pugh settled down, they asked her to print some words on a sheet of paper. Mr. Ramsey, attaché, beheaded, and the number 118,000. And you can imagine after hearing the word beheaded that Linda would be distraught and upset.
Beheaded.
And there you have the dramatization. Upon hearing that word, she assumed that JonBenet had been beheaded. She figured that she and her husband were suspects. The police spent 3 hours talking to the Pughs that night. It's quite a long time. And I mean, that's obviously continuous questioning. And do you think, and that's more than one officer that's present there, do you think the Ramseys endured anything nearly like that at this early stage? Had Linda ever witnessed any signs of SA in the Ramsey household? Had JonBenet ever wet the bed? Had Linda seen semen, blood, or anything unusual on the child's bed or anyone else's bed? And I think the answer was yes. There were a couple of unusual things seen on JonBenet's bed, but we're not going to deal with that right here.
Well, we were accused of which is bizarre, we were accused of taking her to the doctor too many times. She'd been to see the doctor 30 times in 2 years, the same doctor. She had, we had a good health insurance program. He listed all the, she had asthma. The doctor was 5 minutes away.
And that's how the Ramseys responded to questions around this idea of JonBenet's health. Was it neglected? And the bedwetting kind of played into that. Remember, JonBenet had vaginitis a couple of times and I think a bladder infection and various other ailments which necessitated something like 33 visits to the doctor. And in a way, the housekeeper did make sense. Where the ransom note was left by someone knowing that that was where Patsy normally came downstairs in the morning. Now, who would know that? Well, the housekeeper, clearly.
I just couldn't look at it. I mean, I got to this place where my daughter was missing. I went upstairs, she was missing. And I remember looking at this, thinking, who signed it? And then I would kind of glance at it.
That's another sort of bizarre mismatch with the ransom note is you've got a 3-page ransom note and Patsy suddenly is someone who's not very literate. She doesn't really do much more than glance at it. And what else is there to do when they're looking for JonBenet and they can't find her and perhaps they're even waiting for the kidnappers to call? Maybe then is a time to study the note, study the handwriting, study the words, study what it says in the note. And that's one of the bizarre things is that they get the ransom note and basically ignore it. And that in itself, I think, is an interesting clue.
Why on the back stairway? That's not a logical place to leave a ransom note unless one knows that the family uses the back stairs on a routine basis. It shows familiarity with the family. It shows familiarity with the house to know where the back stairs are and the fact that they use it.
Now, to repeat, where the ransom note was left by someone knowing that was where Patsy normally came downstairs in the morning. Now, who would know that? Well, the housekeeper clearly, but also Patsy.
Whoever wrote it is educated. Attaché. That's not a word any thug can use. And hence. Who says hence?
It's addressed Mr. Ramsey. Patsy, don't you find that really weird?
I started seeing what I think is just crazy stuff. Hollywood-type language.
Now, I just want to jump backwards for a second. Here you have an FBI agent talking in detail about the content of the ransom note, and yet you've got these sort of allegations that the FBI weren't involved. And here you've got an FBI agent who's intimately involved in the ransom note, and he was actually at the scene. So do you see how there's a kind of mythology surrounding this case?
When I walked in the door, I asked Officer French where had the body been placed, and he said, well, right there. And I was standing on the very rug onto which John Ramsey had placed the body of his daughter.
What I find fascinating with this is how the cops treat the housekeeper and her husband compared to how they are treating the Ramseys at that point in time and in the aftermath. I mean, in terms of the way they are being treated, they couldn't be more polar opposites. The housekeeper and her husband are separated, questioned for hours, and despite the housekeeper screaming and becoming emotional, they simply ignore that and question her anyway. At the same sitting, if you can believe this, they get specific handwriting samples from the housekeeper. All of this happens on the day after Christmas, just a few hours after JonBenet's body is found. So it's pretty fast work from the investigators. Meanwhile, after JonBenet is found, the Ramseys, both of them, are basically off limits, but especially Patsy. They are not separated and they have lawyered up already. Patsy's emotional state and her doctor basically make it impossible for the police to question her, not only that day, but for the next several days. And then, of course, Patsy appears on CNN, apparently in good enough shape to be interviewed after all. I also think it should be plain to see now just to what extent this whole Boulder PD botched the case thing is a myth. Because it turns out the FBI were involved, were present. Of course, that's not to say that the police investigation was flawless either. So what went wrong? Well, let's go back to FBI agent Ron Walker.
Everybody makes mistakes at crime scenes. And I don't want to lay the blame on any particular person, but it was the philosophy in the police department at that time on the command staff that inhibited the officers and the detectives from doing the job that they knew they needed to do.
So I wouldn't say the investigation was botched. I guess if you say that over and over again, that becomes the reality, the narrative reality of the case. I wouldn't say there weren't enough staff or that the cops were inexperienced. Why? Because the FBI provided expertise on scene and later behind the scenes. We also see that there were multiple detectives involved, and in the hours immediately following the discovery of JonBenet, the cops fanned out and conducted multiple interviews. But the people they most needed to speak to wouldn't speak to them. Whose fault is that? A more pertinent question, I think, is were there some people who didn't want the case to go to trial? And also, is the situation with the Ramsey case exactly where it is because that's what someone wanted? In other words, is it unsolved because someone deliberately frustrated the efforts to investigate it, just as the ransom note was a deliberate effort to frustrate the efforts to find out what really happened? If that is the case, who would want to do that? Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.